Hello, and welcome to today's episode where I'm talking to Hans-Georg Moeller. You're a professor at Macau University, is that right? And
Yes,
you've got the YouTube channel Carefree Wandering, which is how
right.
I've kind of came across your work and read a couple of your papers and things off the back of that. And we're going to be talking about Profilicity today. But before we kind of start, I wondered if you wanted to kind of just describe what your journey has been on YouTube, yourself. So almost, your own profile and how that has kind of shaped your thinking about this topic, and then we'll kind of add some meat to the bones.
That's been a fun journey, which wasn't really intended. I didn't have the intention to become a YouTuber. It wasn't by accident. My student, the producer of the show, Phi is his name. He was like or still is, a local YouTuber, small scale here in Macau. And it was his idea that we'll start a channel because he has this interest in philosophy. So the first video that we did was on the book by Sam Harris on morality that he asked me to read, and then because I hadn't even read it, and then we talked about it, and that led to the first video we did. And then the second video, which made the channel become sort of successful, was on a video that I had used in my class on Kant by the Philosophy Tube channel. And then Phi suggested, oh, we should do another video on this, like a reaction video, because it's a popular genre on YouTube, right? And then when we posted this video, on the very simultaneously, the presenter of the Philosophy Tube channel came out as trans, and that generated a lot of attention on YouTube. And then the algorithm promoted our video along with it because it had just been published at the same time. And so I don't know, this video now has hundreds of thousands of views. And then this immediately made the channel somehow known, and then we just went for the ride. But it was basically entirely coincidental. I think now we have maybe an opposite effect. We now you're talking about my journey on YouTube, so we're kind of playing with a channel and looking, what happens, and of course we also, what happens not only to the channel, also to us personally while we're making this journey, and it's an interesting experience. And just recently, we did a video on the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. I don't know if you know about that, but probably you will. And because that's what YouTubers do, right? They have to always comment on stuff that's just going on, and in order to optimize views and keep the viewership entertained. And our recent videos, like the algorithm had somehow let us down a little bit, and so then we did the Johnny Depp one, and that was an immediate success because you can already tell, like basically after 20 minutes, how the video will be doing, and the numbers were great. But then we found out also immediately that there was a technical problem, and we had to take the video off and then repost it, fix the problem, and post it again. Like an hour later, it took like an hour or so to fix it, and all the viewership was gone, and the video did not perform at all. I think just we basically lost the algorithm by taking the video out. And I kind of have a feeling that this might hurt our algorithm more, not necessarily permanently, but not just for this video. I think once you somehow disappoint the algorithm, it has it is unforgiving.
I think that's right. But I think if you unlist the videos that underperform, then I think that takes them out of the equation in however it's ranking you as well. I have a secret. I mean, I try not to care about this stuff, but I have a secret contact who might be able to tell you about these sorts of things. He occasionally drops into some of my live stream hangouts and things, and so he could probably talk to you about that if you were interested a bit more. But in terms of the
that would
goal,
be great. If you want to share that later, please do.
In terms of the goal that you see yourself as having with the channel, I mean, is it? I mean, are you kind of concerned with growing it to like influence people? Do you want to communicate public philosophy? Is it more about interest and kind of doing these little experiments for you? What do you think the kind of...
Well, there are many aspects to it. Maybe the most important, or probably the most important, is that I find it much more rewarding and also intellectually stimulating than actual academic philosophy. Academic philosophy has become, I talked about it in some videos, it's just like working for a company, and the whole kind of academic atmosphere has changed so much. And so we constantly have to produce and publish, but if you're not like really a top star, and even if you are an academic top star, it's I think seriously, I was very surprised. I think the intensity and the quality of the interaction that I get on the YouTube channel is much better than what I get in the academic sphere. Even, I'm relatively established as an academic. I have no problem I don't want to boast, but it's not difficult for me to get a paper published or so, right? It's not that I'm desperate because I try to find publication space. That's not the case. I mean, but it's just that the publication, they're out there, but you get very little resonance, like true resonance. So this resonance phenomenon is something that I experience as very positive, personally, intellectually. So in this sense, it's really very nice to see that somehow my philosophical engagement has become much more lively than it used to be. So that's a really good thing about it. At the same time, and that's why I use a term like experiment, I'm philosophizing about profilicity. So I'm about in an identity that is very much a kind of identity that is very much manifest on the internet. So it's a form of, I have the opportunity of making a kind of a self-experiment on an empirical self-experiment on the theory that I'm developing at the same time. So that's a second major aspect why this is such a fascinating thing for me. And going back to the first thing, I mean, that we are talking right now, as you said yourself, is an effect of me having the channel. And you're one of several people who actually, have an interest in discussing these ideas, debating these ideas, that otherwise we would have never met. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this discussion. And I mean, that's, for me, that goes back, whatever. It's wonderful. It's like if you have somehow the possibility to go back to ancient Greece and have the forum again and engage with people who are just, heard about the stuff and want to talk about it. And not for an academic competition to show that whatever, maybe whatever your ideas or my ideas are somehow, academically superior, but because of an actual interest in the issue. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, how it kind of potentially democratizes philosophy in a way, or it kind of brings it back to the agora out of the kind of academic ivory tower.
Exactly. Yes.
So one of the things that you talk about a lot in your videos is this idea of profilicity that you've developed with your colleague. And so the first question is, what is profilicity?
Yeah. So Paul D'Ambrosio and I, we wrote this book, You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity. So profilicity is a term that is parallel to the term authenticity. And it's supposed to, it's a word for a way how we build identity. Now, and that is the best way to explain it is that in comparison with authenticity, or what we call sincerity, which again, we take the concept from Lionel Trilling, who wrote a book about sincerity and authenticity. And simply put, the idea is that in traditional societies, people would shape their identities by orientation to living up to a social role, gender roles or other roles, like in the military as a soldier, or professional roles, family roles. And then you would sincerely commit to this role, and thereby you would develop a sense of identity, both for yourself, but also the identity that basically society would identify you as. And that's what we call with Trilling sincerity, which means sincere commitment to roles. So role orientation and identity. And then there comes the shift in modernity, the shift where in the orientation. Now the orientation is no longer the social role, which is now seen as some sort of external conformity. If you just do that, if you identify just by orienting yourself to that role. And the idea is that you should either find or develop, create your own selfhood, your own individuality, your own originality. And that's the age of authenticity, as Charles Taylor called it. So it's a change, a shift in orientation away from the role and towards this unique self, right? I mean, nowadays, whatever, like Western education, and then somehow the parents already operate in the mode that they reconfirm to children their originality and how they are special. And this is kind of the form of identity building, that this mode, this in which identity, at least in Western societies mostly, has been built for 2-3 centuries. Now, Paul and I argue that we are now in a shift, in a transition from authenticity to profilicity. That is, the orientation shifts again now away from the inner self to the profile. And the profile is like the role, something that is somehow external, but it's very different from the role in the sense that it has to be created by yourself. It's not something that you're born into. It's something that is highly unstable, and something that is, which basically connects the things I already said, that emerges through social validation feedback loops. It's something that is kind of a highly dynamic self-image that you somehow project and then also truly identify with. And the term profile obviously is something that is nowadays often used with social media usage. So we have profiles on different platforms, like YouTube profile. But we think it predates this form of identity building. The profile is something that predates actually social media. So CV is also a profile, right? And you develop a professional identity by building your profile in the form of a CV. So that's a basic definition.
As a result of this concept, like in interviewing you in this format, I do feel, there's something kind of reflexive about it, right? Where, because I have the countdown and my kind of branding at the start, I do feel a little bit self-aware, kind of like talking about this, that, like I'm in the Freudian psychoanalysis chair as I present my profile in having a conversation like this.
Right. Me too. Same thing.
Yeah. Could you kind of explain this concept of the general peer as well that you introduce, and how that kind of plays a role in profilicity?
Yes. This concept is meant to kind of correspond in some way to the role of the peers in traditional society, which are essential to confirming your role. Actually, I don't know if anyone's interested in this. The sociologist Goffman, who wrote about the presentation of self, and he studied very much how how the building of selfhood, basically in the form of sincerity, happens like a theater performance, right? But the important thing about the theater performance is that you have people, the other people who act with you and the audience, who are all present, right? So and of course that's the case. The role is enacted and performed in the presence of present peers, family members, whatever, fellow soldiers, fellow believers in the church, and so forth. And it's very important, right, that whatever your role as mother is confirmed by your other family members, by your children, for instance, right? And this is the core audience, the present audience that you are performing your role to, and where the recognition of your identity has to come from, right? Your children are really the most relevant peers for confirming your role as a parent. They can't really be, they are privileged, right, in doing that. And when this, for instance, doesn't work, or the other way around, then there will be severe psychological consequences. Now, the strange thing with Profilicity is that the peer is somehow not present and not really an individual peer, like we are experiencing right now, right? We're performing this, we're intentionally doing this, you and I, where we have no clue who is watching, and yet we are orienting ourselves precisely to this general peer, just as a mother orients herself to her children. And then the whole identity building she has as mother is in orientation to these present peers. Whereas right now, we shape an identity, like with a CV, for an audience whom we do not and cannot know. So that's the general peer.
So in terms of sort of, I suppose, motivating this concept, or like getting people to see things in these terms, why is it a kind of fruitful way to look at things, or why is it a useful concept? And I understand, in some of the things that I've read, you've kind of left space to say, well, look, like this kind of opens the avenue for like maybe further sociological or psychological research in various areas. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of that.
Just before we talked, I saw this book announcement I hadn't heard about, by an analytic philosopher, David Chalmers, Reality Plus. Have you heard about the book?
Yeah, I have. Philip Goff and Keith Frankish recently just interviewed him on. They have that Philip's at Durham University and Philip's a panpsychist, Keith's an illusionist. So they have this kind of YouTube channel where they interview people about philosophy of mind. And they recently just talked to him about that book on their channel.
So I haven't read the book. I didn't even know about it. As I said, I just read the book description on Amazon. But apparently the point of the book is from an analytic perspective, which is very different from, I have no background in analytic philosophy, to show that virtual reality is actually a real reality. Now, I come to a very similar conclusion, but from a completely different background, from an existential philosophy and from social theory, social systems theory, which is also very different from analytic philosophy. But so it's both an existential and also socio-political concept, if you want. And I just want to show, and that's what is fruitful to know about Profilicity, that this kind of existential experience that we are having is somehow very real. But I don't know if Chalmers does the same thing. I think that's from the description what he's trying to do. So in that sense, it's similar. Then with the second thing, since I don't know the book, I have no clue if that's also the case. I also want to say we need a new vocabulary. So we need a new vocabulary to understand ourselves and to understand how society operates, because the conditions of shaping identity have changed. And we have this, like with new technologies. Marshall McLuhan used this phrase somewhere, that technology somehow projects us or helps to project us into a new reality. And yet he uses this metaphor. We still kind of describe ourselves by looking into the rear view mirror. So, and I strongly think that that most of the public discourse and also most of the philosophical discourse, and maybe that's what Chalmers also is addressing again, I'm not really sure, is still stuck in what we see in the rearview mirror, in the like age of authenticity vocabulary. And that is not just a theoretical problem. And that's important to highlight. And that's also, again, why the channel is so interesting. Because it's not just like an academic that you just have a merely conceptual, so to speak, ivory tower discussion, but you actually have a discussion where people very much relate from their own personal experiences. And so I see how the channel is helpful, and the discussion on Profilicity of the channel are helpful for me as well, to develop a kind of new vocabulary slowly that is more adequate in making sense of our of the very core experience of who we are. And so, yeah, that's really, I think, what I find important or useful about the concept, that it can, I think, I hope, and it still has much to develop, but that it may provide a kind of a new quality of the level of reflection, self-reflection, and experience of our contemporary existence.
The video, I don't know if it's the most recent video you did, but the one on sort of looking at the phenomena of suicide as well through the lens of Profilicity. Right. I thought some of those comments were quite interesting.
Yes.
And also responses that I've seen people have to your observations on people like Jordan Peterson, for example, where I think a lot of people in my generation in the YouTube space have kind of been sent down rabbit holes by the algorithm into, various political ideologies, religious ideologies, and so forth. And someone like Jordan Peterson is maybe a kind of manifestation of that. And maybe your Profilicity language is helping people to kind of reflect on those things that have kind of happened to them and understand them and interpret them in different light.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I hope so too.
So my next question then is, in your kind of, in the language that you deploy, as you said, you kind of working on developing a vocabulary to kind of help people understand things in a particular way. How come you refer to concepts like authenticity as technologies, rather than I suppose concepts or something like that?
Right. Well, there are concepts describing technologies. The term technology is kind of somewhat stolen from, it's an old concept. It goes back to Greek philosophy. We use it maybe in a sense that is similar to Foucault, but we don't really have a strictly Foucauldian approach. And also Foucault is not, as I say, didn't invent the term, right? So, but in the Foucauldian kind of tradition, right? So Foucault also talks about technologies of the self and things like this. Now, technology highlights two things, and I think that also what the term does in Foucault's work. Two central aspects: construction, something is constructed, and very importantly, contingency, right? So you can use different technologies, right, to construct things, and there's a variety of technologies, and the technologies are subject to constant change. They constantly develop and are kind of radically changed, right? And so these two elements of that identity, right? They are all identity technologies: sincerity, authenticity, and Profilicity. And so by using the term technology, or the concept of technology, we indicate, Paul and I, that identity is constructed, and that its construction is contingent upon the use of certain methods, use of certain tools, use of certain kind of, again, like it's a whole kind of scenario of things that is then applied. This can be whatever moral. There's moral aspect to them, ethical training, political aspect. All these aspects come together, and together they constitute a technology for constructing selfhood. So again, the 2 points are construction and contingency.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well, because a lot of the discourse in some of the topics that you're commenting on. I mean, if you look at like Matt Walsh's recent documentary, "What is a Woman?" Right, there's a lot of the discourse is traded around kind of like essentialist views of language,
right.
and so almost in coming to see things in this way, it's like almost in coming to see things this way, people are kind of your views almost engaging at odds with some of the views that are kind of out there floating around as well. So that's an interesting point about the contingency of it. So you've commented on some sort of public figures who are doing philosophy in a public space. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about how it is that Profilicity kind of affects public philosophy. So, I mean, public philosophy has historically been done in a manner of different ways, but I mean, I suppose the phenomena of kind of YouTube and channels like you've mentioned already, like PhilosophyTube, or the School of Life. I've forgotten Alain de Botton, like his kind of thing, and there's various kind of other niches, I suppose, that people try and fill, which sort of maybe commodify or sell philosophy to people in a particular kind of way, versus maybe the kind of public profile that I'm engaging in and doing. I don't mean to hold myself on a moral high horse or something, but I think I'm trying to satisfy a kind of different niche in the market, as it were. And I wondered what your views are on how kind of this concept of Profilicity intersects with doing public philosophy and shapes then what it is that philosophers come to do. And then we can kind of talk about, well, how should they, kind of engage with Profilicity?
That's a complex question. I mean, it's maybe, again, that is an overgeneralization, but under conditions of sincerity, which is very strong in the Chinese tradition, the philosophy, and this is what actually the term, when the term was translated basically via Japanese into Chinese, it basically means, doing philosophy means to emulate the sages, to form your. I always remember, I worked on this contemporary 20th century Chinese philosopher Fang Youlan, one of the major Chinese philosophers, and in his autobiography, he mentions this one sentence, which I always, even though I read this like 30 years ago, sticks to my mind. So when he was young, and then he told his teacher, this was like in the 1910s, that he wanted to do philosophy, which is still something considered fishy here in China, not because of political reasons, but because it's not a thing to where you can become rich. So when he said, I told my teacher I wanted to become a philosopher, and then the teacher responded, "Oh, so you want to become like Confucius," right? So, and that is the traditional idea of a philosopher under conditions of sincerity, at least one idea under Chinese conditions of sincerity, that you sort of go through this process of self-cultivation and basically adopt the role of the master, right? So it's also a kind of a role orientation. Shaping your identity as a philosopher means that you have to become like whatever, not the same, but very different. But the technology is somewhat similar to if whatever in medieval Europe someone decided to become a monk, right, and then orients themselves to the emulating the monks that are already there, and then of course very strongly in the age of authenticity, where I guess most of the viewers as well, like me, grew up, if you want to become a philosopher, that was still like the idea that I was also pursuing when I was younger. It means you have to be really original. Right, you have to develop your own way of thinking and everything. It means you have to be like, that's whatever, read Sartre or read Heidegger, and so the whole point is that the philosopher is the most somehow authentic. That's the way to really be authentic, right? It's the Kant would say the Königsweg, the royal road. Is actually is through becoming authentic, and philosophy is the form in which you develop your authenticity in the deepest possible way, right?
And the idea there is that because you're kind of going into this inner self and sort of getting at the essence of maybe who you are and expressing it in various ways.
Of course, yes, exactly. And again, I'm not saying that's the case for all philosophers, but it's been crucial for me as a philosopher, and I think for many of my generation, especially under the influence of continental philosophy more than analytic philosophy. But I would guess it's not that different in analytic philosophy. And then, of course, now with a profile, as you mentioned, we have like figures like, not that we didn't have stars before. I mean, Heidegger also was already during his lifetime some sort of philosophical star, but he was a star of authenticity. And but now the stars you mentioned, whatever, like Peterson or even Zizek, right? They are very good at branding themselves. And that's what everybody is doing, and that's what constitutes their success. That doesn't mean that they're not also authentic, or that they're not also somehow dedicated, committed teachers. But the what is really central to their actually being recognized as philosophers is their capacity in profile building.
And there's something interesting in both of those cases, actually, because I suppose, I mean, Zizek and Peterson are kind of very, very different people in terms of their, the kind of thoughts that they have and so forth, the ideas that they expound. But the similarity, I suppose, is that, at least for me, coming across these people in the first place, there's just these kind of memes that float around, in the social space of like people who are into Zizek. I can't quite pronounce his name properly. Like the memes about kind of sniffles or whatever, and the memes about the way he expresses himself, and then people just find themselves kind of sharing these things amongst each other, and then adopting like the language of the ideas that Zizek talks about, and I think similarly for Peterson as well. And it's you're definitely right in that. There's like the branding element just kind of comes apart in some way.
Yeah, and then they look at the synergies, right? I mean, the Zizek-Peterson debate, that's the perfect example for profile building today, right? And this whole event, I think it was also live streamed or something like this, at least, and it was sold, had to pay for it. And the whole thing, it was staged, and how the audience reacted, like cheering, and everything. And as you said earlier, you have to have the everyone belongs then to a camp. And compare this. I just recently rewatched I don't know if you've seen this, 50 years ago, the famous Foucault-Chomsky debate. And there's a completely different atmosphere, right? And again, it's not like, look at the audience, right? There again, like, this is completely still mode of authenticity, right? How everyone is just like a deep thinker who sits there and reflects critically on both of them, and doesn't really, and it's not, even though it's also a mass event, even though it's also televised. So it's somewhere also there, these profile elements are already there. And yet, we've reached a completely different stage, as you can, and they don't, the level of how they express themselves, that certainly doesn't really go to mass audiences. It's, even though they both, regard themselves as leftist and so forth, so they want also to kind of speak to the people, they actually don't, right? The level of the is so elaborate, the level of their communication. So it's like it's much more, I think, clear still, the authenticity. And then whenever you go back in earlier stages where there were also debates between philosophers, and I think you see the mode very much changing in the formation of the identity of the different philosophers.
I think this observation I find interesting because, as you say, it's sort of the conditions for success or something in the culture have kind of changed, right? But so I feel like maybe I have intuitions that attach to real moral facts or something, but I mean, maybe I've just been socialized into that old morality, and so I kind of feel, in a sense, threatened by the new kind of Lebensform or whatever you might call it.
Yes.
The way.
Well, many people do, and sorry for interrupting you,
no,
but
okay.
I'm just confirming what you're saying. It may be a little too.
Well, no, so it leads into my next question, which is just so like in light of this, I mean, people who are reflecting on this, how should they move forward in shaping the discourse? I mean, should people and obviously there's going to be assumptions about kind of moral frameworks and stuff in that kind of should, but I mean, should people resist this sort of thing? Should they work to combat it? Should they embrace it and kind of reject authenticity? Even like, what are your thoughts about?
Well, this is like I have this discussion all the time with friends, with people like you who we meet for the first time, who just watch the channel, and importantly with myself too. I ask myself exactly the same question, and just responded to some viewer today on also the same question. Shouldn't we somehow defend authenticity? Shouldn't we somehow reject profilicity? Isn't it the job of the philosophers to not only warn us of profilicity, but to show that it's somehow worse than authenticity? Shouldn't we kind of defend authenticity against the invasion by profilicity? And shouldn't we protect ourselves, importantly, including myself, right? Shouldn't I protect my own authenticity from becoming overly prophilic? So that is a central question. Now, my basic response to this is, which often I don't really get the time to point out. We think, Paul and I, because it's actually Paul's term, that despite all these different technologies, sincerity, authenticity, profilicity, the basic condition of human existence, if I may use such a big term, is genuine pretending. And we use the term pretending. This is something we developed out of Taoism. And the idea is, again, pretending is similar as playing, like child play. So these different technologies are different ways of pretending, of performing selfhood. And in the performance, you develop genuineness. So that is the basic idea, and which we all need to do. It's similar, again, to, I mentioned the sociologist Goffman, right? He uses the theater metaphor for how people build identity. But that doesn't mean, and this is the whole point, that identity is something false. We have no identity to begin with. Right? And these technologies are contingent. You can use any of these technologies, and all of them somehow work. Otherwise, they wouldn't be applied. And all of them, at the same time, produce problems. None of them is ideal. None of them is the right one. None of them is true. So we all kind of, no matter which technology we use, we all operate basically on the basis of genuine pretending. So this, again, means, which we take from Taoism and also Buddhism, if you want, but also somehow from social system theory, that, well, if identity is constructed and contingent, it is basically empty to begin with, right? It doesn't have a core. And in this sense, which also means there's something that authenticity as such is also not really, the true answer to the problem of identity. But yet, of course, we're all educated with this, or most of us are kind of, we socialized and we became who we are in the mode of authenticity. So we're all biased, authenticity biased, and we somehow do and must feel that this is the right way to be ourselves. Now, but given this, again, this basic approach of genuine pretending, from which theoretically you can see that all these different technologies are basically equally valid, you can at the same time see, and this is the point that we're trying to make, that really the problem is if you over-identify with your identity, right? So in sincerity, this would be the problem, that whatever, you become very much a fundamentalist, fundamentally committed to the role, which results, whatever, patriarchalism, or which results in militarism, right? If you overly, or which results in fundamentalism in religion, right? If you overcommit to the father role, you end up with a pathological emphasis on that, and many people over-identify with that. And for instance, in Confucianism, which is highly patriarchal, there's an over-identification with all kinds of family roles, not only father, but children, and so it produces all kinds of pathologies. Same thing, as I said, with religion, right? If you overly commit to the religious roles or to the military roles, it can become highly problematic and pathological. But it's difficult to see this if you're in the mode. And similarly, I would stipulate, I mean, a lot of the problems we have now result from an over-identification with authenticity and the whole kind of hyper-individualism that we have, and this kind of a whole culture over-emphasizing the pursuit of originality until it becomes, ridiculously self-contradictory and so forth. But generally, like this Western mode of this very obnoxiously arrogant mode of individuality, which becomes very self-contradictory, and so I think there also, and that leads also to all kinds of pathologies, narcissism or whatever, and of course the same is true for Profilicity. So again, I think to summarize and go back to your question, I think the task of the philosophers is not to defend authenticity, but it's also not to reject authenticity. The task of the philosophers is to remind us about genuine pretending, and thereby prevent us from over-identifying, from becoming identity fundamentalists. And I think that is the real threat. The real threat is not the loss of authenticity, because authenticity is just fine, just as sincerity is just fine. And as Profilicity can also be just fine, as long as you don't over-commit to it, or over-pursue authenticity, or overly invest in your profile. So, and that's like kind of the therapeutic approach, which again is strongly informed by Paul and my background in Taoism. So it's not really, and we mentioned this explicitly at the end of the sanity chapter of the You and Your Profile book. It's not normative. Our approach is not normative, but therapeutic. So the point is not, and this has to do with my whole philosophical work, going back to my book on morality, The Moral Fool, to show the problems from a therapeutic perspective, to point out the problems of normativity.
To lead the fly out of the bottle is my one of my favorite philosophers would say. I guess in what you're saying there, there's a lot of interest to me. Is the problem with identifying with one of these roles, was the phraseology that you used, is the problem there almost this underlying Buddhist idea of like that attachment then is going to lead to suffering?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, that's how we would put it in a Buddhist way, exactly. And this attachment can be equally strong to the imagined core self, or to the imagined original individual that you must be, and you must enable everyone else to be the same individual, right? It's an underlying ideology that also leads to pathological wars nowadays, just as these other ideologies can equally lead to wars.
I think this concept of Profilicity is actually quite useful for talking about, like those conditions of success that cultures promote, and then as you're kind of saying, looking at almost like this higher order phenomena of various kind of cultural pathologies then that arise out of creating like sort of distorted conditions for success. I mean, I'd need to flesh out what I mean by distorted there, but I think I think that's interesting. Okay, so on that note, how does Profilicity kind of intersect then with religious and political movements? So we see kind of increasing polarization, particularly in America and other Western countries. And then we also see, I mean, particularly in America, this being tied into kind of like various culture wars or kind of Christian nationalism and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting to see how, for instance, the political discourse, I mean, this was always also about profile building, but it has now become like really so much at the forefront. That with basically the disappearance of the traditional ideological oppositions, right? Where going back to the 19th century, where let's say many Western but basically globally, there was always the contradiction between, let's say, the more conservative-oriented bourgeoisie and maybe at the same time also Christianity-oriented or politics, conservative, informed. And then you have the revolutionary moments, which were, very much about working class and so forth, right? And different social and political models. Do we want, do we want like whatever, like do we emphasize private property or do we emphasize public property? And similar things. Do we emphasize workers' rights or do we emphasize, the right to a free market and stuff like this? And that has been very much replaced by just the shaping of kind of different profiles, right? There is very little disagreement left on these issues. Some disagreement, but actually very little, right? As we see, whatever the left in America or in Europe and so forth, it has basically totally dissociated itself from the working class, which used to be its origin, basically, right? Its basis, its foundation. And they no longer really take up working class issues, nor are they actually getting elected by working class people. And much less do they have representatives of working class people in the actual functionary class, right? So instead, it's whatever. It's like producing different profiles, like whatever, Microsoft and Apple, right? And so this kind of reorientation of politics, that you shape some form of fan club, and then, but the important thing again is that it works equally in having people identify themselves with that, right? So it doesn't lack in power, right? That's why the culture wars. That's what they call culture. We can also call them profile wars, because people are so strongly, truly invested in their profile. They get a total kick out of it, and they shape their own sense of selfhood, which is the most fundamental thing, by being a Trumpist or by being a liberal and whatsoever, right? So this is a very, very attractive profile offer for them. And that's, I think, very much how politics is performed nowadays, right? So again, this contradicts with this kind of traditional idea of, for instance, a class-based politics, where basically your political affiliation was more or less predetermined by your class identity, which is no longer the case at all.
And I guess that is sort of exemplified in maybe gesture politics, you know. So you see a lot of the stuff around like mask wearing, for example, or showing like solidarity with like Black Lives Matter by doing something.
All these become virtue signaling, right? All these become signs, become signals that signal specifically, they're profile signals. And the important thing is, both psychologically and sociologically, that's why they work. Just like in a sense, what's somewhat similar to religion, because that's the way we now build a sense of identity, both of ourselves and others. Again, not by being born into a role. And that's, again, like in the past, like if you go back to the role thing, you were just born into the role. It was more or less clear. There wasn't really a choice, you know. But nowadays, everything can be and must be. Everything must be curated, including gender.
Yeah, I guess it's like profile signaling. Maybe you might want to do it. Yeah. Going back to the thing I mentioned about Buddhism and the root of suffering, there's almost a different Christian perspective on this as well that might have some pertinence. Augustine says sort of like, my mass is my way. My mass is my love. So if I love like my profile being this particular like political thing, whatever, then my life kind of like centers around that in a way. And he obviously has a very different view to the sort of Buddhist view then, that we need to kind of, well, I mean, debatably the Buddhist view that we should kind of like detach ourselves from these identities and things, because in Augustine's view, if you kind of make God the center, then it in some sense fixes things. But I suppose if God's a kind of apophatic nothing, then it might be very similar to Buddhism in a way as well, or like kind of an ineffable nothing.
But isn't it? Again, like I think your points are completely valid, but from my perspective, and I don't think it's a contradiction to what you said, just like a different way of looking at the same thing. With Saint Augustine, for instance, who you were talking about, then in the Confessions or whatever, there is such a strong emphasis, I think, on, again, sincere commitment to being a believer, right? This is what is like the turning point for him, right? He was this sinful young man, and then at some point in time, he starts to sincerely commit, dedicate himself, devote himself, right? This devotion to the faith, and this devotion to becoming basically some sort of saint, that this is really the constitutive, again, technology of his identity building, and thereby also the technology of his philosophy construction. The writing of the book is basically just an expression of his sincere commitment and of his devotion.
And I think that the book is one of the first autobiographies as well in the West, though I might be wrong about that. So in this idea of kind of the technology of authenticity or whatever, it kind of is a landmark in the West. And I think in the story he talks about as well, having read Athanasius's The Life of Antony, which is, so that's obviously not an autobiography but a biography about this desert father who kind of he goes out, he converts to Christianity and goes out into the desert, and various kind of like kind of like sex demons appear to him and try to seduce him in various ways, and he kind of resists, through the power of prayer and so forth. But a couple of, I think, Roman senators converted and like abandoned, left their old lives behind as a result of reading about the life of Antony, and this really impacted Augustine. I guess maybe you could describe that in terms of, he saw a particular kind of profile that someone could create, like the profile of Antony or something.
Again, I would see it much more in the sincerity model, and like Confucius, you have a role model, and then you try to emulate this, and you turn yourself by commitment to the faith. And it's not, you're not trying to be original. You're not trying to be different from everyone else, but you're trying to completely devote yourself to the faith, and thereby you find your true identity, which is not an identity that is something unique kind of selfhood, but what is this kind of is God given?
It's in the community. Is what you're saying, rather than it being, it's not like some pure a priori, like I just introspected and pulled this out of me. It's
right. Yes. I see Augustine again as a representative of identity building in the mode of sincerity.
So this is the next question is kind of similar to the question that I had about how philosophers should think about shaping the public kind of discourse in light of Profilicity. But I wondered then what your thoughts were on, obviously, this sort of thing is affecting culture at large. Like there's various kind of like protests, marches, movements of either people like quitting like low paid jobs. You could argue these things they don't have to be negative, they could be good things as well, or people changing their lives around the teaching of someone like Jordan Peterson or whatever. Like how do you think that sort of nation states should respond to the Profilicity technology? And obviously your perspectives in China are probably going to be fairly different, because you've talked about in China they have obviously like the social credit system, which is like a form of profile building but with different conditions of success, I suppose.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of discussion, and you rightfully point to them, and they are very important about how to deal with big data and so forth, and all the new technologies and how they contribute to profiling and profile building. And there are lots of very contentious issues. Again, from a philosophical perspective, as I said earlier, and sorry for repeating myself, I think the first task is that we need like a more adequate vocabulary, because of also the vocabulary there is still very much the authenticity vocabulary, right? Where it's whatever privacy rights and so forth. And I think that there's a problem that we still don't really have an adequate vocabulary. And so I think maybe philosophy, but also literature or art, I think it's important that we, in these social dimensions, develop a better understanding of what Profilicity is, and maybe this will then eventually also help shape political and legal developments in that regard. I just like my colleague Elena Esposito has wrote a book recently about artificial, she calls it artificial communication. The gist of the book is somewhat different than your question. What I think what a lot of these technologies do, and I think that's where your question like is getting at, right? Right? How should you were mentioning the social credit system and similar things.
Yeah, the questions, I suppose it's getting at like maybe there's a concern, at least in Western countries, about the way that this is kind of, the kind of upheaval, I suppose, behind. I mean, someone like a Hegelian or a Marxist or whatever might understand, what's going on in terms of, various forces working, ideas working themselves out through history, or the war of material conditions or whatever. But in terms of Profilicity, I suppose you can kind of understand what's going on as shaping and changing the structure of society in a particular way, where there's at least some upheaval, right, when these identities kind of clash with the previous structures and institutions that exist and so forth. And whether you think that countries should be kind of like maybe legislating against social media use or something to or not. That's what I'm getting at with the question.
Yes. I mean, whatever. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, right? I just did a video about him. He was suggesting that use of social media directly contributes to suicide and depression among teenagers, especially teenage girls. So a concrete issue would be, should the state, for instance, legislate against this, right? There should somehow be kids, the access of kids to social media, should this be somehow limited, right? Just as we don't allow kids to drink alcohol or drive cars, right? You could imagine something similar. Now, again, I think that may make sense, but I don't think we understand the phenomenon well enough yet. And that's why I cannot really give a concrete or informed answer to your question. If, as I suggest in this video, the kids somehow, the depression or the kids may have something to do with both with their failure to build a prophilic, a high-profile identity, as well as with, and that was my core point, still a very strong social expectation that they should be authentic rather than prophilic, and that they can't really cope, those who suffer from it, that they can't really cope with these contradicting expectations. Number one, there's still the shadow of the age of authenticity that is still through the rearview mirror so much present in their parents and so forth. And on the other hand, the actual demand to be prophilic on social media. Then I think we first must understand this dynamic. As you said, we first must understand this clash better. And then we can, once we understand it better, then maybe we can come up with a better form of, for instance, legislating or somehow organizing the use of social media of teenagers. As long as we just don't really understand the phenomenon, I don't think such a thing as, okay, we just block social media access of kids is somehow a blind measure.
Because something I wonder about, especially with the kind of intersection of profilicity with politics, is how profile building could kind of drive even like war rhetoric, say for like war with Russia, because
of course it's extreme. Ukraine. Obviously, it is very much the case, very much the case.
So,
but again, this has always been the case, right? You always, in order to wage war, you need strong identification. So you apply the identification technology that is available to you, because you need people to identify with your side.
Right. So, I mean, that's it in terms of my questions. But if there are people in the audience who have questions that haven't been answered, and they can put those up now, and we can go through them. The time of day here means I think most of my audience are asleep in America, but we'll see. Let me see if I've missed anything in the chat. Are Buddhists attached to their identity of being a Buddhist, or is the rejection of identity not itself an identity?
That's actually something, for instance, in Zen Buddhism, that becomes a very central theme. That in many of these Zen Buddhist stories, they tackle specifically this problem, that the Buddhists become too attached to their identity of being Buddhist. So to kind of overstate it a little bit, you can say the core of Zen Buddhism is a practice that is supposed to prevent Buddhists from becoming too attached to their identity of being a Buddhist.
Let me see other questions that I might have missed from earlier. I can just see a lot of comments.
Also, I think it's a good question by the viewer. So that is what the viewer identifies as a problem is a very, very real problem. Now, the answer I think that both Buddhism gives and that I think we also kind of give the general answer to the question is, so on the one hand, yes, like the Zen Buddhists do, you must especially tackle this problem. Don't become, as a Buddhist, don't become too much attached to your identity as a Buddhist. At the same time, it's impossible not to have an identity, right? The point is just to have your identity and being aware of the constructedness of your identity and the contingency of your identity. Everyone has an identity and necessarily has to have one. So the point is not just, to get rid of an identity, which would be absurd, but to create a certain ease and flexibility and in your identity, not only for yourself, importantly, but also in order to function well with others. Like, again, like a mother that over-identifies with motherhood becomes eventually not only kind of that does not only become a problem for herself, but it becomes a problem for everyone else in the family too. And in the same way, going back to the example that you give, if you overly identify as a Buddhist or as a Christian, and then start to missionarize everyone, and then maybe eventually kill everyone who doesn't, believe you, and the Buddhists also did these things. It's not something that the Buddhists never did. Then it becomes a problem. So now it becomes pathological, not only for yourself, but also for how you interact with the rest, with other people around you. But again, the point is not to get rid of your identity, but to enact your identity, no matter if it's your family role identity, or if it's your religious identity, or if it's your authentic identity, or if it's your prophilic identity. The point is to see the constructedness and contingency and be at ease with it.
Okay, so another question then was, in a world of profilicity, are people who prefer a low profile, for example, staying off social media, after all, they keep putting studies showing it makes us feel worse, going to be disadvantaged?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Yes, you're somehow disadvantaged, right? I mean, it's like whatever, like in an old society, sincerity society, if you don't build up, if you're not really recognized as a very much dedicated warrior, and maybe you're then regarded as a coward, or in religion, you're regarded as someone who lacks faith, and so forth. So that is a kind of disadvantage. And then the question is, are you okay with it? Can you cope with the fact that you're regarded as low profile, or that whatever, in sincerity, you're not regarded as a good mother, or you're not regarded as a good Christian? And that poses problems. And nowadays it may increasingly pose problems for people to have a low profile. It may be, and I mean, it becomes an increasingly thing, like again, in politics, right? It becomes problematic. If you're not somehow, if you lack, if you lack a political profile, then there's somehow, people cannot really identify who you are, and it becomes more difficult to build like a convincing identity. And yes, that's a problem then.
I can think of the social media site LinkedIn, where people have like their corporate profiles as well as being one place. And there's something about that place that's almost like it's almost like a circle of hell, because people, it's that intersection with with corporate values, which is so kind of grayed out and inhumane, right, and so forth, and people kind of trying to identify themselves with that thing. But that's one area where, if people want to get ahead in that corporate world, they have to like network in that way and so on.
Yes.
Okay, Vesper asked, why do philosophers need to shape discourse?
Well, that's a good question too. I don't know. I mean, that was your question.
It was my suggestion, yeah.
Yeah. No, maybe that's a kind of a too arrogant assumption that they actually can do this. But we like to kind of ascribe somehow this role to ourselves, or this function to ourselves, I should rather say. And
I've been reading recently a book on the Enlightenment where the guy suggests that there's kind of this, he's a historian, he suggests that there's this sort of philosopher's myth of the Enlightenment, that it was all of these kind of people thinking about ideas in this way that influenced culture, when really what happened was there's kind of a bunch of political movements that kind of characterized the Enlightenment and change structures and things, and then there were just kind of a few philosophers who were kind of hanging around who were like, oh yeah, here's my ideas.
Yes, I tend to agree with that, and also with Vespa there, that we probably strongly overestimate our ability to do that.
Daniel asks, would be interested in Prof Moeller, if Prof Moeller has any insights on whether Profilicity tends towards moral language as activist profiles grow.
Obviously, but again, that's the case with any technology. Moral language is so powerful. I mean, the most powerful mode, I would say, of language, right? And again, like it becomes a tool, a very important communicational tool for supporting any kind of identity building. It doesn't matter which one, and you can combine all of them. So yes, absolutely. Profilicity tends towards moral language strongly, but this is not different from the other technologies. All of them do that.
Which philosophers influenced or directed us towards the Profilicity culture, or is there no connection to philosophy at all?
I think this idea of Profilicity, or the concept Profilicity, is strongly rooted in language philosophers and people like Baudrillard and others, philosophers of the virtual simulation. These are notions by Baudrillard, and they already have basically described the Profilicity phenomena, and already also developed a first kind of vocabulary. So again, like you ask which philosophers, French philosophers like Baudrillard, like Derrida, like Foucault, like importantly Debord. But you can also look at Walter Benjamin, for instance, with his influential essay on the work of art in the era of technological reproduction. So these are all, even Wittgenstein to some extent, with his focus on language and how language works, no longer as mainly a tool of reference, but as usage, that the usage of language counts. These are, I think, very important predecessors of descriptions of Profilicity today.
I think that highlights sort of the history of the theory, but I think maybe the question is also trying to get at which philosophers have kind of influenced the culture itself, like like in the world, that people are behaving in this way.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yes, that people are actually behaving like this. I don't think that there is a kind of a normative that I don't think there is any philosopher who says, you should all be prophilic. Let's all be prophilic. I don't think that's really the case. And maybe that's a weakness of the theory, because there were many philosophers who said, oh, yes, let's all be authentic, right? And the Profilicity philosophers, maybe because we're too early, they basically say, we all becoming prophilic, and there's a problem with that.
So the last question, I think, is what do you think of Deleuze's idea of replacing the concept of the individual with the dividual, and how would that interact with Profilicity? And I think you'll have to introduce the idea of the dividual in your answer if you could.
I mean, the individual, the term means the non-divided, right? And that's, again, like very strongly connected with the notion of authenticity, that you find this kind of atomic, which is also the same. Greek is just Greek for individual. Atom is not individual. And then this idea that we have this atomic individual that is like the idea which is central, somehow it's connected with authenticity, because you have to find, again, this core, right? The atom individual, this core self that can no longer be divided. So that is an idea that is very much becomes very much. Yeah, that's why authenticity is a form of individualism in the very strong sense of the term individual. And then Deleuze, postmodernist thinker, and my whole thinking is very much postmodernist, I would claim, and therefore closely related to Deleuze.
You're one of the postmodern neo-Marxists that's destroying the West.
Yeah, maybe. And so the ideas of personhood is different, right? That we individuals, that we are fragmented, that we are multiple, that we don't really have a center, right? And that multifarious. And that connects to the notion of profilicity, because also profiles do not emerge from an atomic center, not from a core self. And it's also, they are multiple. And you can divide yourself into multiple profiles. So the notion of profilicity, as the viewer rightly points to, is much more akin to the notion of the dividual than to the notion of the individual.
And this is, I think, you've talked about in some of your videos, like the idea of the kind of public and private self and the kind of mismatch between them, and how that sometimes the private self people aren't familiar with can then be presented through maybe some uncontrolled media, kind of outside of the PR or whatever, and that can like damage the public profile that's been built, and that things like
right.
that. Okay, so that's it for questions. In terms of what you're working on at the minute, do you want to give people something to kind of look forward to, or direct them? Would you just say go to your YouTube channel and wait for whatever next video is coming out, or is there a book you're working on or something?
Well, I'm interested in the notion of gender and identity, which is, of course, a super popular topic right now. And that's something I'm working on with some colleagues at the moment. But this is very much at the beginning. But I also like to view, simply put, my working hypothesis is that we see this transition from role to profile via the bridge of authenticity, also with regard to gender. So that traditionally gender was identified by gender roles, and now the hypothesis is, now the task is for everyone, for all of us, to curate a gender profile. And that's something I'm interested in, because that also is like philosophically, because it's philosophy channel, I mean, that's very much rooted in this question, and questions that also Foucault, for instance, asked himself about biopolitics and about sexuality, and how this kind of how this connects existential topics, again, which I said earlier, with socio-political topics. So the body and gender, which are different things, but are related to one another, how they also connect very much existential and socio-political issues.
So I just changed my name as a joke, because like phenomena like putting pronouns, for example, like in your profile and things like that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think it also, this was something that was interesting about your, I suppose, one critique of your video about Abigail Thorne when it was, which was, you know, kind of when you became popular, was people kind of saying, well, some people sort of might say, well, you're just criticizing her, you know, because she's trans or something like that. But I think that you were offering a kind of genuine critique of the how like being trans or being a particular gender or sexual identity is also tied into like the idea of building a public profile. Like sexuality or gender expression can sort of be kept. It can be kept a private thing. I'm not making any normative claim about it should be or anything, like, because I don't care, but it can be. But in that video, I think the thing you pointed out was when that, you know, there's clearly like this kind of stage that's been set, and she says something like, I'm not acting anymore, this is real. Yes. But exactly. You know, there's in like 4K and with me, and it's like, hang on, you just woke up like this kind of thing. Like,
yes. But this is like I mean, that's a general contradiction of Profilicity. That's by no means just something that it's very, very interesting when it is connected with gender, as in this case. But it's a contradiction that we all basically display, right? And again, I'm not saying that this is. I think it just makes this contradiction visible. So I perform that I'm not acting, right? And it is somehow true, because we are in Profilicity. We become genuine. All these are modes of genuine pretending. We become who we are by performing, and by we project a profile, and then we become truly invested in this profile.
A question that just came to my mind in, as you said that, is, does this sort of belief then like undermine the legitimacy of adopting any kind of given profile that someone adopts? You know, because like to be a person in the world is to sort of like believe that you are, you know, the kind of roles or those kind of characters that you adopt, right? But if you kind of have this belief, you're always going to be sort of thinking, well, look, I've kind of adopted this because it's convenient for me in the conditions I'm in, or, you know, it was trained as a child to think about things in these ways, and it sort of undermines then the legitimacy of any identity that you adopt.
And I encourage to see it the other way around. That connects very much with the central question you brought up earlier, right? So we have the idea that this self, which we believe is our authentic self, is something that has not been somehow created, but something that has either been somehow found, something that we've always been from the beginning, or that is something that we've, you know, originally created, just of our own original, or the double meaning of the word original, right? Either it refers to original or it's an original creation. But isn't it much more sort of honest to say that we try out different profiles on the basis of the again contingent of the contingent things that that provided to us by whatever our bodily contingencies? No one chose their body. That is provided by the society we live in, by the education we get, by the books we happen to read, right, by the friends we happen to have. And all these kind of completely incongruent things come together, and then we put them somehow together and try out certain profiles, and then we find certain profiles that for whatever reasons we are capable of being truly invested in. So again, the point is that this kind of selfhood is not something that's already there, that always already, as I hate this phrase, has been there, but that is something that we try out, we develop, and then we increasingly become actually truly invested in it, and they're not fake in that sense. So that's something I really want to put out there. Again, I'm not trying to glamorize Profilicity. I think Profilicity has as many problems as authenticity, or probably maybe even more, and as sincerity, potentially more. But nevertheless, I think in one of its I say advantages is that it's somehow less deceptive. It's less deceptive about the original core self, about the core of selfhood than authenticity.
So I think that's interesting. So are you saying that so rather than this recognition of Profilicity undermining it in the sense that my question sort of suggests, undermining these sort of characters that we adopt, it is the case that you are, even if you were conditioned into like adopting a certain kind of behavior in a particular culture, which means which means like I'm in pain or something, it's like nevertheless you are in pain if you are expressing that particular if you're expressing yourself in that particular kind of way. Okay, that's a role that's been taught to you, but it's not to say that like you're not in that state or in that identity, as it were. Is that
right? Yes.
Yeah.
There is a story in the Taoist text, Zhuang's a kind of famous story, and there is this fantastic diver. He can dive into like a waterfall, and then Confucius comes and sees him. And in Taoism, the notion of swimming is the image, the metaphor of swimming is very central, which is for Taoism, it's the same character as being at ease, which I regard as the central notion of Taoism. So swimming is like a metaphorical expression of the existential mode of being at ease. So there's this swimmer who can, like diver, who can then dive down this waterfall and swim in the gorges, and then Confucius comes and asks him, "Oh my God, how can you survive such a thing? You must have a very special technique or something like this." And he says, "No, I don't really have a special technique. I don't have a special Tao. I just, grew up on land, and eventually I became comfortable on land, and then I got to the water, and eventually I became used to at ease with the water." And so in a similar thing, I think that's the idea of adopting an identity. You have to develop the capacity to, given the contingency of your environment, the contingency of the conditions that you are thrown into, to use the Heideggerian term, to somehow, and that's the task that we all have, to develop on the one hand an identity that you're sufficiently and comfortable with and at ease with. And on the other hand, that you, as I pointed out earlier, which is a different aspect that is not covered in this story, that you also don't over-identify with it. And you have to kind of find the right balance between the two. And I don't see why this is less possible in Profilicity than in the other two modes. Right? I mean, there are many more modes that are potentially possible.
I think something maybe I see is that over-identification sort of leading to some of those pathologies that emerge. So like a lot of the arguments I think that are given in the like what is a woman or trans debate, kind of like anti-essentialist arguments from our language about gender being like socially kind of contingent on the culture that we're kind of brought up in, right? But then this weird thing happens where the new categories that are being introduced are then seen as like essentialist Aristotelian forms or something. And
exactly. It's a kind of total reversal of the initial proposition that gender is contingent. But no, then it becomes like an again, like the danger is then you over-identify with and reify it and essentialize it, and then the piece is lost.
So in terms of, I kind of messed up my last question because I started asking you a bunch of questions about other things afterwards. But so just to close, in terms of things for people to look forward to, then I'm guessing that you're working on like a video then about like this. What is woman?
No, this is a long time project. I'm just still working. The videos. Basically, we have as a YouTuber, you have to produce everything like 2 or 3 weeks. So, and we just do this basically just whatever comes up. The gender project is a long-term project, academic project.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, people can go over to Carefree Wandering and obviously check you out if they want to see more of the kind of topics that we've been discussing today. other than that, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the question.